Very warm welcome, viewers, in the program Halate Hazra with Dr. Tahir. I'm glad today I have a very distinguished guest, Professor Julian Richards. He's Director of Security and Intelligence Studies and Associate Dean at the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Buckingham in the United Kingdom. He is the author of several books, articles, and research papers on security, intelligence, terrorism, counterterrorism, extremism, radicalization, international relations, and politics. He regularly appears on national and international media for his expert opinion and analysis. Today, I'll discuss Ukraine and Russia conflict with Professor Julian. Professor, thank you very much for your time and for accepting my request for an interview.
My pleasure, Mohammed.
The straightforward, we just move to questions about Russia and Ukraine conflict. At present, Ukraine and Russia is an international conflict, and every country around the globe, especially Europe, is very much concerned. Please, could you give a general overview to my viewers about the root causes of conflict in Ukraine?
Okay, yes. Well, it's like a lot of conflicts, this is a very complex situation. It's much more complicated than it first appears, and it has a long history to it. So there are two things to consider here, really, and a lot of the history goes back to the Cold War period when the Soviet Union was in existence. So for many years during and indeed before the Cold War, Ukraine has changed its status on the map. There are periods where it was an independent state. There are other periods where it was part of other states. It was part of the Polish Empire. It's been part of the Russian Empire at various stages. And in the Cold War, it was what was called a Soviet Socialist Republic. So it was a part of the Soviet Union. It was effectively a kind of independent state, but wasn't really independent. It was part of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Now, in 1991, as we know, the Soviet Union collapsed at the end of the Cold War, and all of the Soviet Socialist republics, like Ukraine and many others, such as Belarus and Georgia and Armenia, Azerbaijan, numerous others, they became independent states. So Ukraine's current status as a state dates from 1991, which isn't that long ago in the grand scheme of things. Now this is complicated for Russia because Russia considers these types of states in particular to still be within its orbit of influence. And one of the big problems Russia has had in the post-Cold War period is a sense that NATO has increasingly moved eastwards and encroached on what Russia considers to be its security space, its buffer zone that it considers should be rightfully under its influence. The Eastern European states, the communist Eastern European states that were in the communist bloc, so Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Czech and Slovak republics, they fairly quickly joined NATO after the end of the Cold War. They applied to join, they were accepted. Russia was really not very happy about that. It feels that there was an implicit guarantee that NATO wouldn't expand eastwards at the end of the Cold War, that it would stay where it was before. But NATO did admit these new members to its alliance. But there was always a kind of implicit red line for Russia that if it was to start allowing the former Soviet Socialist republics like Ukraine to join NATO, that would be stepping over a particular line, and NATO would be washing up against the shores of Russia in a way that it really didn't want. That's the first simmering issue. The second thing is that in 2014 there was effectively a revolution in Ukraine in which the pro-Russian government that was very much sort of bound by Russia's rule and influence, and was trying to stop Ukraine from becoming a NATO member and also a member of the European Union. This government was effectively overthrown by a new West-leaning liberal government in a really bloody and messy revolution. The Russians accuse us of it effectively being a Western-sponsored coup. I'm not sure that's at all true, but that's the narrative. And this caused a crisis for Russia because suddenly Ukraine was looking like it was going to join the Western European and NATO camp. Now, an extra dimension to this is that in parts of eastern Ukraine, particularly in what's called the Donbass region and Crimea and one or two other areas, there are quite significant communities of Russian-speaking individuals as opposed to Ukrainian-speaking individuals. And there have been problems there. There's been schisms between the two communities. The Russian-speaking population feels it's been discriminated against to a certain degree. There's some evidence that local authorities in those areas were trying to outlaw Russian being spoken in schools and in public places. So there's been a simmering tension between the Russian-speaking and Ukrainian-speaking communities in those parts of Ukraine. And 2014 was where it all blew up and came to the surface. Russia effectively annexed Crimea and started to get involved in conflict between rebel groups in the Donbass region. And one of the interesting things there is that they observed that NATO didn't do anything at that time. We were cross, we expressed angry words about it,
yeah,
but we never really held Russia to account for effectively annexing Crimea. So this may be the reason why President Putin thought a much bigger and deeper operation in Ukraine would be possible and would receive relatively little response from NATO. So all of these things have come together, some of them deep historical factors, some of them more recent developments in the region, to lead us to the present crisis.
Yeah. Professor, we saw in the past that NATO countries, they jumped with boots on ground with full force in Libya, in Afghanistan, and 2 times in Iraq. However, in the case of Ukraine, a NATO country very much clear, and including the United States, the United Kingdom, that they will provide weapons, diplomatic support, moral support, and financial support. But they will not physically intervene in this war. Do you think it's a double standard of NATO countries, or fear that Russia is a significant military power, having 5,977 nuclear warheads? So what is your take? What is your opinion, please?
Yes, well, it's a very good question, Mohammed, and of course it's an obvious question to ask, and many people around the world will be saying, hang on a minute, this is a clear case of double standards on NATO's part. As you described, we were happy enough to invade very comprehensively in Afghanistan and Iraq. We've undertaken military actions in Libya, maybe not boots on the ground so much, but aggressive air strikes and air campaigns. So why are we not keen to do so here when it's right on our doorstep? I think there's a couple of things. I mean, one is that this probably won't convince those around the world that see this as double standards, but each of these cases are slightly different. And there are slightly different circumstances that apply in each of those cases. Afghanistan, for example, was triggered by an attack on a NATO country. Now, as we know, the Article 5 in the NATO treaty says that if any NATO member country is directly attacked, the rest of the alliance is duty-bound to respond militarily. So the 9/11 attacks in the US in 2001 were considered an act of war, and were considered grounds on which to respond militarily in Afghanistan, where Al-Qaeda were hosted and protected by the Taliban regime. So that's is actually the first and hitherto only time in history that Article 5 has been invoked, was in the Afghanistan conflict. Now in Ukraine, you could argue that Ukraine isn't a NATO member country at the moment. Russia hasn't yet directly attacked a NATO member country. So the circumstances are slightly different. For NATO to launch a military attack against Russia would have to be done on a different basis. It isn't in defence of a NATO member country. There's also the practical considerations that, as you rightly say, Russia is a big power. It has nuclear weapons. It's whether it would use them or not is a question we're all asking at the moment, but it has said it would use them. President Putin has said he's placed his nuclear forces on readiness status. So the calculation has to be different. You know, if we're going to start getting involved in a big boots on the ground military conflict in Ukraine, the implications of that could be very large and very broad, and we could be straight back into World War territory effectively. So I think there's an understandable reluctance by NATO to go down that road yet. I mean, obviously, if a NATO country was attacked, if there was an attack that went over the border into Poland, for example, or into the Baltic republics, then that would be different. NATO would be bound to undertake a military response. So it's for NATO, it's a difficult situation because they're inevitably going to be accused of double standards. You know, we're happy enough to go into certain countries very comprehensively, but we suddenly are rather reluctant to do so when we're up against the Russians. And there's not an easy answer to that, but I think there are very real practical reasons why that's the case. We also saw in Syria, incidentally, where Russia became heavily involved in support of the Assad regime, that NATO was similarly reluctant to put boots on the ground in Syria for the same sorts of reasons, really, that if we ended up shooting down Russian planes, then we would effectively be going into war with Russia, and then the whole thing would have got a lot bigger and messier. So these are hard rationales for people to accept when they're on the ground, in Syria or in Ukraine at the moment. It must be very frustrating for Ukraine and Ukrainians to see this huge military force across the border that appears not to be doing anything at the moment. But we have to be level-headed, and we have to consider the implications and consider when and how we get involved.